The rope was already tight around Alfred Ralston's neck when Maria Carter's horse came tearing down Main Street, its hooves throwing up dust that caught fire gold in the late afternoon sun. "Stop!" she screamed, standing in the stirrups, a folded telegram clutched in her fist like a weapon. "Stop this hanging. He didn't kill Everett Whitfield. I have the proof in my hand." The crowd gathered beneath the crossbeam outside the feed store turned as one, faces slack with surprise. Up on the wagon bed, hands bound behind him, Alfred Ralston did not close his eyes and pray the way a guilty man might. He looked at her, and something in his chest that had already begun to accept the drop of the trapdoor beneath his boots loosened just enough to hurt worse than the rope. "Maria," he said, low, disbelieving, as though saying her name might make the moment more real or less. The man holding the reins of the wagon horse, a heavy-set deputy named Corliss who had been sworn into duty only that morning by a self-appointed committee of angry ranchers, raised his hand to stop her. "This ain't your business, Miss Carter. The town council decided." "The town council decided based on lies that came out of Garrett Kessler's mouth," Maria said, swinging down from her horse before it had even fully stopped, her boots hitting the dirt hard enough to jar her teeth. She was breathing as though she had run the whole 6 miles from the telegraph office herself instead of riding it, her hair come loose from its pins and whipping across her face in the wind that had been rising all afternoon, a hot, dry wind that smelled of dust and distant smoke. "I operate the telegraph line in this town. I decode every wire that comes through Fort Worth before it goes anywhere else. Last night a message came through meant for Kessler's lawyer, and it was never meant for anyone in Larkspur to read, but I read it, because it came in scrambled and I had to untangle it word by word." She thrust the paper toward the nearest men, and gathering of ranchers and merchants who had, an hour before, been perfectly willing to watch a man die, because Garrett Kessler had told them with great sorrow and great certainty that their Marshal had murdered Everett Whitfield in cold blood over a dispute about grazing rights. "Read it," she said. "Every word." Nobody moved for a moment. Then old Dr. Prout, who had delivered half the babies in the county and buried the other half of the grown men who died of fever or gunfire, stepped forward and took the telegram from her hand. He read it once silently, his lips moving, and then he read it aloud, his voice shaking with the particular fury of a man discovering he had almost participated in a murder. The telegram, sent from a Fort Worth attorney named Prescott Dane to Garrett Kessler, spoke plainly of arrangements already made, of a payment of $200 to a man named Boone Hardy for what it called removing an obstacle, and of the necessity of the town believing the Marshal responsible for Whitfield's death, so that the Whitfield land, and more importantly the spring that fed it, would pass quietly and without further inquiry into the hands of the Texas and Gulf Railway Company's local agent. "That agent," Maria said into the stunned silence, "is Garrett Kessler. He is standing right there at the back of this crowd, and I would ask someone to make certain he does not leave before the circuit judge arrives to hear the truth of it." Every head turned. Garrett Kessler, a lean man in an expensive gray coat that had never once been touched by cattle dust, went the color of old ash. For one long moment nobody in the crowd of 40 or 50 townspeople moved, and then Dr. Prout was climbing up onto the wagon bed himself with a pocket knife to cut the rope from around Alfred Ralston's wrists, and 2 of the larger ranchers had already closed in around Kessler so that he could not so much as reach for the pistol at his hip. Alfred did not say anything at first. He simply stood there rubbing his raw wrists, looking down at Maria Carter as though she were something he had never expected to see again in this life, some kind of miracle arrived on horseback with dust on her cheeks and fire in her eyes. "You rode out here alone," he said finally, "in this wind, with that." "I rode out here because a man was about to die for something he did not do," Maria said, and only then did her hands begin to tremble, now that the danger had passed and there was nothing left to do but feel the fear that had been riding beside her the whole way. I was not going to let that happen while I held the only proof of it in a drawer in my office. He climbed down off the wagon on legs that did not feel entirely steady, and when he reached the ground, he did the only thing that felt honest in that moment. He took her hand, the one still holding the empty air where the telegram had been, and he held it the way a drowning man holds a rope thrown from shore. "Thank you," he said. "I do not know how to say more than that right now. Thank you." Around them, Corliss the deputy was already reading Garrett Kessler his rights in a voice gone hoarse with shame at how nearly the town had hanged an innocent man on his committee's word, and someone had been sent running for the circuit judge, who was known to be holding court 2 days' ride south in Wichita Falls, and would not arrive for at least 3 more days, which meant Garrett Kessler would spend those days in the town's one jail cell, and Maria Carter would spend them wondering what exactly a man like Kessler might do when he was cornered and desperate, and still had money enough to hire men who did not ask questions. That evening, after the crowd had dispersed, and the sun had gone down blood-red behind a sky thick with dust the wind had lifted off the plains, Alfred Ralston walked the 6 miles out to the telegraph office instead of taking a horse, because he said later he had needed the time to think, and because some part of him had wanted an excuse to see her again that same day rather than waiting for morning. He found her sitting on the step of the small frame building that housed both the telegraph key and, in the back room, the narrow cot where she sometimes slept when a night message could not wait until dawn. She had a rifle across her knees, not raised, not even particularly alert, simply resting there the way another woman might have kept a shawl for warmth. "You expecting trouble already?" he asked, stopping a respectful distance away, the way a man raised right stops when he comes upon a woman alone at dusk. "I have found," Maria said, "that trouble does not wait for an invitation in this country, Marshal Ralston. Better to be sitting with a rifle in my lap than to be caught without one." "Alfred," he said, "please. After today, I think we have gone well past needing to use my title." She looked at him for a long moment in the failing light, taking in the lean, weathered face, the eyes that were kind even now, hours after nearly dying, the wide shoulders that had not once tried to loom over her the way some men's did when they wanted a woman to feel small. "Alfred, then," she said, "sit down before you fall down. You look like a man who has been hanged and cut loose in the same afternoon, which I suppose you are." He sat on the step beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth still radiating off him from the long walk, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. The wind gusted hard enough to rattle the telegraph office's tin roof, and far off toward the horizon Maria thought she could see heat lightning, though it might only have been dust catching the last of the light. "How did you know," he asked finally, "to look for that telegram at all? You said you decode everything that comes through. Do you read every private word that crosses this wire?" "No," she said. "I would not do that to the people who trust this office with their business." But that particular message came through garbled. The transmission line must have been affected by the wind we have been having, and when a message comes through garbled, I have to untangle the code word by word to make certain nothing is lost. I could hardly help understanding what I was reading as I fixed it, and when I understood what it said, I understood also that a man was set to hang in the morning for something Garrett Kessler had paid to have done by somebody else entirely. "You could have simply reported it to Corliss," Alfred said. "You did not have to ride into town yourself, into a crowd like that, with Kessler's men still free and armed." Something in Maria's spine straightened at that, a small but unmistakable stiffening. "I could have," she agreed. "But Corliss was the one who tied your hands, Alfred. I did not know who else to trust with something that could not wait for a committee to reconsider its opinion. I made a decision, and I rode, and it turned out to be the right one. I would ask that you not spend our first evening as friends telling me what I ought to have done differently." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again there was something almost sheepish in his voice, an honesty that she would come to learn was rare and precious in him. "You are right. Forgive me. I have spent 12 years being the man responsible for other people's safety, and it is a hard habit to set down even for one evening, even for the woman who saved my life this very afternoon. Then we will have to work on setting it down together, Maria said, and though her voice was still edged with the day's exhaustion, there was something warmer underneath it now, something that had not been there a moment before. Because I intend to keep making my own decisions, Alfred Ralston, Marshal or no Marshal, grateful or no grateful. I have been making them alone out here for 5 years, since my father died and left me this claim, and I do not plan to stop simply because a man wants to protect me. I would not ask you to stop, he said. I only ask that you let me stand beside you while you do it. It was not quite a promise and not quite a courtship, but it was the beginning of both, and they sat together on the step of the telegraph office until the wind grew too fierce and too full of grit to bear, and Alfred walked her the short distance to the door of the back room, and left her with nothing more than a tip of his hat and a look that told her plainly he intended to return. 3 days later, when the circuit judge finally arrived in Larkspur, dust-covered and exhausted from the ride, Judge Harlan Beckwith heard enough of the telegram evidence and enough of Dr. Pruitt's account to order Garrett Kessler held over for a full hearing on charges connected to the death of Everett Whitfield, though he was careful to note, in his slow, deliberate courtroom manner, that a full accounting of land deeds and railway contracts would take considerably longer than a single afternoon to untangle, and that in the meantime Kessler would remain in custody in the Larkspur jail while a proper investigation was conducted. It was during those following weeks, while lawyers wrote letters back and forth to Fort Worth and Austin, that the true shape of Garrett Kessler's scheme became clear, and it was during those same weeks that Alfred Ralston, restored to his badge and his authority though not yet to his full peace of mind, began riding out most evenings to the little frame telegraph office on the edge of town, and sometimes farther still, to the modest homestead 6 miles beyond it, where Maria Carter had spent 5 years proving up her father's claim. Kessler, it emerged through careful digging by a young attorney the railway company sent down from Fort Worth, once it became clear their local agent had brought considerable scandal upon them, had been quietly forging and altering land deeds for the better part of 2 years, always aiming his attention at the handful of properties along Cottonwood Creek that controlled access to the only dependable water for 15 miles in any direction. Everett Whitfield's land had been the largest and most valuable of these, and when the old surveyor discovered that his own deed had been tampered with to shrink his water rights and refused to sign away what remained, Kessler had hired Boone Hardy to see to it that the old man's objections went silent permanently. Alfred, as Marshal, had been closing in on the forged deed after Whitfield's widow came to him with her suspicions, and so Kessler had arranged, through a false witness and a planted knife, to have the Marshal himself accused of the very crime Kessler had ordered committed. That left one property still standing between Kessler and complete control of Cottonwood Creek and everything it watered. Maria Carter's homestead sat directly across the spring from the Whitfield land, and her father's original claim, unlike Whitfield's, had never been altered because Kessler had not yet found a way to get close enough to the paperwork to do it. Now that his scheme lay half exposed, and his hired gunman Boone Hardy remained free and unaccounted for, Kessler's lawyer in Fort Worth, and Kessler himself from behind the bars of the Larkspur jail, understood one thing with perfect clarity. As long as Maria Carter lived to testify about the telegram she had decoded, and as long as her homestead claim remained intact and unpurchased, the railway's plans for the creek and Kessler's freedom hung by the thinnest of threads. It did not take long for word to filter back to Alfred, through a nervous store clerk who had overheard 2 strangers asking questions in the saloon, that a bounty had been quietly offered, $100 for the woman at the telegraph office to disappear, no questions asked about how. He rode out to the homestead that same night, arriving well after dark, his horse blowing hard from the pace he had set. Marya met him at the door with her rifle already in hand, though she lowered it the moment she recognized him against the lantern light spilling from the doorway. "Alfred, what has happened?" "There is a bounty on your head," he said, without preamble, because he had decided on the ride out that she deserved the plain truth and not some gentled version of it. $100, offered through men connected to Kessler's lawyer. "I want you to come into town, to stay somewhere I can watch over you properly until this is settled." Marya stood very still in the doorway, the lantern light catching the sharp intelligence in her face, and when she spoke her voice was even, though he could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "This is my home, Alfred. My father proved this claim with his own hands, and I have kept it these 5 years alone, through drought and through a winter that killed half the cattle in this county, and I am not going to abandon it now because a coward in a fine coat has decided I am inconvenient to him." "I am not asking you to abandon it," Alfred said, though even as the words left his mouth he understood the shape of the mistake he was about to make. "I am asking you to come somewhere safer while I handle the men Kessler has hired." "You are asking me to leave my land in your hands to handle," Marya said, and now there was steel under the evenness of her voice, "as though it were something you could manage on my behalf while I sat quietly in town and waited to hear how it turned out. I decoded the telegram that saved your life, Alfred Ralston. I have fired this rifle at coyotes and at men both when the need arose, and I have not once needed anybody to handle things on my behalf. I will not start now." He opened his mouth to argue further, and then stopped himself, because something in the set of her jaw reminded him powerfully of the moment she had ridden into Larkspur 3 weeks before with the wind tearing at her hair, and a piece of paper that had saved his life clutched in her fist. She had not asked anyone's permission to do that. She had simply done what needed doing. "You are right," he said finally, the words costing him something, an old certainty about his own usefulness that he had carried since he first pinned on a badge. "I am sorry. I keep falling back into thinking that protecting someone means deciding things for them. It is not a good habit, and you have caught me at it twice now in as many weeks." "It is not a terrible habit," Marya said, some of the steel softening out of her voice, "so long as you are willing to be caught at it and to change your course when you are. Most men I have known would rather be right than be good partners. Come inside, Alfred. If there are men coming for me in the night, I would rather face them with a friend beside me than have that friend standing guard over an empty house in town while I refuse to be there." It was the closest either of them had come to admitting how quickly and how deeply something had taken root between them, and Alfred Ralston, stepping across her threshold into the warm lantern light of the small homestead kitchen, felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled since the moment the rope first touched his neck. They did not have long to enjoy the fragile peace of that understanding. 4 nights later, with the wind rising steadily all afternoon into the kind of hard, dry gale that made cattle skittish and set every loose shutter in the county banging, 3 riders came up the trail toward Marya's homestead just after moonrise. She heard them before she saw them, the particular rhythm of hooves moving with purpose rather than haste, and she was already at the window with her rifle in hand when the first torch flared to life in the yard. "Miss Carter," a voice called out, rough and unfamiliar, "you would do well to pack what you can carry and be gone from this place by morning. Some things are best left be." Marya did not answer immediately. She watched through the gap in the shutter as 3 shapes resolved themselves in the torchlight, and recognized, from the deputy's earlier description, the broad-shouldered outline of Boone Hardy himself, returned from wherever he had been hiding since the hanging that had not happened. She raised the rifle, sighted along the barrel through the gap in the shutter, and fired once into the dirt well short of the nearest rider's horse, close enough to make the animal rear and scatter the torchlight wildly across the yard. "This is my land," she called out, her voice steady despite the hammering of her own heart, "proved up by my father and held by me for 5 years under lawful claim. The next shot will not land in the dirt. There was a pause, then a low laugh from Boone Hardy that carried no real amusement in it. Feisty for a woman alone out here, ain't you? Kessler said you might be trouble. Kessler, Maria called back, is sitting in a jail cell in Larkspur, and you would do well to remember that $100 is not worth a rope, Mr. Hardy, which is precisely what you will earn if you set one more foot toward this house. It was at that moment, with the wind screaming across the open plain and the torchlight throwing wild shadows against the homestead walls, that a second set of hoofbeats became audible over the gale, approaching hard and fast from the direction of town. Alfred Ralston came up out of the darkness at a full gallop, his badge catching what little moonlight fought through the blowing dust, a rifle already braced across his saddle. "Boone Hardy," he called out, his voice carrying with the particular authority of a lawman who has decided the moment for patience has ended. "You are under arrest for conspiracy in the murder of Everett Whitfield, and for attempted arson and assault on this property tonight. Drop your weapons and step down, or I will make certain the charge against you includes resisting a peace officer, and there is no jury in this county that will show you mercy for that." The two men riding with Hardy, hired hands with considerably less invested in the outcome than their leader, exchanged a glance visible even in the torch's uneven light, and one of them was already backing his horse away before Hardy could stop him. "You are one man," Hardy said, though there was less certainty in his voice now than there had been a moment before. "And she is one woman with a rifle. The two of you against the three of us don't seem like such good odds to me." "The two of them," Maria called from the window, working the lever of her rifle with a sound that carried clearly across the yard, "were good enough odds a moment ago when it was one woman against three of you. I do not believe adding a marshal to my side has made the arithmetic worse for us." Alfred brought his horse up alongside the edge of the yard, close enough now that the torchlight showed the steady, unhurried way he held his rifle aimed but not yet fired, giving Hardy every chance to choose the wiser path. "Boone," Alfred said, and something in his tone had gentled slightly, the voice of a man who had once, perhaps, known Hardy as something other than a hired gun. "Kessler is finished. His lawyer in Fort Worth has already started talking to save his own skin, and every word of it points back to you and the money you took to kill Everett Whitfield. You can ride away from this yard tonight and take your chances running, or you can stay and hang for a crime that was never worth $100 to begin with. I am giving you the choice Kessler never gave Whitfield." The wind howled between them, flattening the torch flame nearly sideways, and for a long moment nobody moved. Then Boone Hardy spat into the dirt, wheeled his horse hard, and rode off into the darkness without another word, his two companions close behind him, leaving the abandoned torch to burn itself out slowly in the dust of the yard. Maria came out onto the porch on legs that had gone suddenly unsteady now that the danger had passed, the rifle still in her hands though her grip on it had loosened considerably. Alfred swung down from his horse and crossed the yard to her in 3 long strides, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, simply standing close together in the wind while the last of the torchlight died out behind them. "You came," she said finally. "I heard from the store clerk that Hardy had been seen buying rope and coal oil in Wichita Falls," Alfred said. "I rode as fast as I could once I understood what that meant." "I had it handled," Maria said, though there was no real argument left in her voice, only a kind of exhausted honesty. "I want you to know that. I had it handled before you arrived." "I know you did," Alfred said. "I saw the shot you put in the dirt in front of Hardy's horse before I even came into the yard. You did not need me tonight, Maria. But I am glad I was here anyway, not because you needed defending, but because I did not want to be 6 miles away wondering if you were safe while you fought 3 armed men alone." She looked up at him, at the sincerity written plainly across his face, and something in her chest that had been braced tight against the possibility of being managed, of being handled the way Kessler wanted to handle her land, eased into something warmer. "That," she said, is a very different thing to say than what you said 4 nights ago. I believe you might actually be learning." "I have a very good teacher," Alfred said, and when he reached up to brush a strand of wind-tangled hair away from her face, she did not pull away. The weeks that followed brought a strange, uneasy calm to Larkspur. Garrett Kessler remained in custody, while Judge Beckwith's court gathered testimony and documents from Fort Worth. And Boone Hardy, having fled south with his companions, was reported by a passing drover to have crossed into the Indian Territory, beyond the easy reach of Texas law, though Alfred sent word to the federal marshal's office all the same, unwilling to let the matter rest until it was fully closed. In the meantime, Alfred Ralston courted Maria Carter with the same steady, unhurried care he brought to everything he did, and Maria, for her part, allowed herself slowly to be courted, though she never once set down her rifle or her independence in the process. He came to help her mend fence one Sunday afternoon, arriving in his shirt sleeves instead of his badge, and she put him to work stringing wire while she dug post holes beside him, and when he tried, out of old habit, to take the shovel from her hands and finish the digging himself, she looked at him with such patient, amused exasperation that he laughed aloud and handed the shovel back without argument. "I have dug every post hole on this claim myself for 5 years, she told him. "I do not need rescuing from a shovel, Alfred." "No," he agreed, "you do not. Forgive me. I believe some part of me simply wants an excuse to be useful to you." "You are useful to me," Maria said, straightening to look at him directly, sweat and dust streaking her face in a way that he found, to his own quiet surprise, entirely lovely. "You are useful to me in the way a friend is useful, and a partner which is different from the way a rescuer is useful. I do not need rescuing. I need someone who will stand beside me while I do the work myself." "Then that is what I intend to be," Alfred said, and he meant it with his whole heart, though it would take the trials still ahead of them to prove that intention true beyond any doubt. They took their supper together most evenings after that, sometimes at her homestead table with the lamp turned low against the coming night, sometimes on the step of the telegraph office while she waited for a late message to come through the wire. He told her about growing up on a small farm outside San Antonio, about the brother he had lost to fever during the war years, about the long, lonesome stretches of riding circuit as a young deputy before he had ever imagined himself settled enough to want a badge of his own, let alone a home. She told him about her father, who had brought her out from Georgia as a girl of 12 after her mother died, about the years of drought and grasshoppers, and one terrible winter that had nearly broken them both, about the fierce, private pride she took in every fence post and every furrow of turned earth on the claim that was hers by law and by the sweat of her own hands. "Most men," she admitted to him one evening, the wind gentler now than it had been in weeks, carrying only the ordinary dust of a Texas summer instead of the howling gusts that had plagued the county, "when they learn a woman holds her own claim, decide it is a puzzle to be solved. Either they want to marry the claim away from her, or they want to convince her she cannot manage it and ought to sell. You have never once suggested either thing to me, Alfred, and I find I trust you a great deal more for it." "I do not want your claim," Alfred said simply. "I want you. Whatever you decide to do with the claim and with your life is your business to decide, and I would be honored, whenever you are ready to consider it, to be part of that life alongside you rather than instead of you." It was as close to a declaration as either of them had yet spoken aloud, and Maria did not answer it with words. She simply reached across the small space between them on the porch step and took his hand, and they sat together in the gathering dusk, while the first stars came out over the plain, and neither of them felt any need to say more. The fragile peace shattered on a night in late August, when the wind that had been building steadily for 2 days finally reached the kind of violent, howling pitch that old-timers in Larkspur spoke of only in low voices, the kind that tore roofs from barns and snapped telegraph poles like matchsticks and sent tumbleweeds crashing across the open range in numbers thick enough to choke a fence line. Maria was at the telegraph office that night, working late to relay a backlog of messages the storm had delayed, when she smelled smoke on the wind, faint at first and then unmistakable, carrying the particular acrid sharpness of something more than a cook fire. She stepped outside into the howling dark and saw, far off toward the Whitfield property and her own homestead beyond it, a line of orange light glowing low against the horizon, spreading even as she watched. Her first thought was for the telegraph line itself, the wire that connected Larkspur to the rest of the world, and she hurried back inside to send word to Alfred and to the railway office in Wichita Falls before the fire, if it reached the poles along the creek, could sever the line entirely. Her second thought, close on the heels of the first, was for the Whitfield widow and her 3 children, and for the half-dozen other homestead families scattered along Cottonwood Creek, whose cabins and barns and winter stores stood directly in the path of whatever had started burning. The message went out just in time. 20 minutes later, as she was saddling her own horse to ride toward the fire herself, the wind tore the last telegraph pole nearest the creek clean out of the ground, and the line went dead. Alfred arrived at a dead run only moments after the wire failed, having seen the glow of the fire from town himself and guessed immediately where it must have started, and worse, why. "Kessler's man," he said, swinging down from his horse in the yard of the telegraph office, his face grim in the light of Maria's lantern. "It has to be Hardy, or someone paid by that same money, wanting to burn out every homestead along the creek, so there is nothing left worth arguing over in Judge Beckwith's court. Maria, the wind is driving it straight toward your place and the Whitfield place both. Then we have no time to waste standing here talking about it," Maria said, already swinging up onto her horse, rifle secured across her saddle, a coil of rope and 2 canteens tied on behind. "The Whitfield widow has no husband to help her get the children and the stock out. We ride there first." They rode hard through a night gone strange and terrible, the wind screaming across the plain thick with the smell of burning grass. The sky ahead lit an unnatural orange that pulsed and shifted as the fire found fresh fuel in the dry August grass. Cattle bawled in panic somewhere off in the darkness, spooked animals running blind before the smoke, and twice Maria had to haul her own mount hard sideways to avoid a stampeding knot of steers crossing directly into their path. They reached the Whitfield cabin to find the widow, a slight, exhausted woman named Ruth Whitfield, already struggling to load her 3 children and what few possessions she could carry into a battered wagon while the barn behind her, struck by a wind-blown ember, had already caught along one entire wall. "The horses!" Ruth cried, over the roar of wind and distant flame. "I cannot get them to load, they are too frightened of the smoke." Maria was off her horse before Alfred had even finished reining in, moving toward the barn with the particular calm competence of someone who had handled frightened animals her whole life. She pulled her own bandana up over her nose and mouth against the smoke, and went into the burning barn without hesitation, talking low and steady to the 2 terrified horses inside, her voice cutting through their panic with a familiar, unhurried cadence. And within a minute, she had led both animals out into the yard, blinking and trembling but calm enough now to be harnessed. Alfred, meanwhile, had gotten Ruth Whitfield's 3 children settled into the wagon bed, along with what bedding and food stores they could gather in the few minutes they had. And together the 4 adults, Alfred, Maria, Ruth, and Ruth's oldest boy, a solemn 13-year-old named Daniel who handled the reins of the second wagon horse with grim determination, got the wagon moving away from the burning barn, just as the roof gave way behind them in a shower of sparks that the wind snatched up and carried. Terrifyingly, out over the dry grass toward the next homestead down the line. "There is no time to reach every family individually," Alfred shouted over the wind, riding alongside the wagon while Maria brought up the rear on her own horse, watching for stragglers and driving the loose Whitfield stock ahead of them toward the creek crossing that offered the only real fire break for miles. We have to get everyone moving toward the creek and across it. The fire cannot easily jump open water, not even in this wind." It became, over the next desperate hour, a running relay of rescue, riding from homestead to homestead along Cottonwood Creek, rousing families from sleep with pounding fists on cabin doors and shouted warnings carried on a wind that seemed determined to drown out every human voice. Maria's knowledge of every trail and creek crossing in the county, learned over 5 years of riding the land herself, proved as valuable as Alfred's authority and his steady, reassuring presence in convincing frightened families to leave homes and possessions behind and simply run. At the Prout place, Dr. Prout himself, roused from sleep, took one look at the glow on the horizon and began loading his wife and his medical bag into their buggy without argument. At the small cabin belonging to a young couple named the Ashers, married only that spring, Maria had to physically pull the terrified young wife away from trying to save a chest of wedding linens, shouting over the wind that linens could be replaced, and she could not. By the time they reached the creek crossing itself, a rough ford where the wagon road dipped down through cottonwood trees to cross the shallow water, they had gathered nearly 30 people, 4 wagons, a dozen loose horses, and a small disorganized herd of frightened cattle, all of them moving together in the strange orange half-light of a night sky turned the color of a forge. The fire, driven by the relentless wind, had by now grown into a wall of flame visible for miles, consuming the dry grass of the open range with a speed that left no room for anything but urgent, immediate motion. Sparks rained down out of the smoke-thick air even at the creek crossing, and twice Alfred had to beat out small fires that caught in the dry grass at the very edge of the ford before they could spread toward the fleeing families. "Maria!" he shouted, over the chaos of frightened animals and shouting people. "The Asher's wagon is stuck in the mud on the far bank. They cannot get the horses to pull it through." She was already moving, riding down into the shallow water toward the stuck wagon, and Alfred followed close behind her. Together they worked the panicked wagon horses free of their tangled traces, while young Mr. Asher tried, with more determination than skill, to lever the wagon wheel free of the mud that had swallowed it to the axle. "We cannot save the wagon," Maria called out finally, over the roar of wind and approaching flame that had by now closed to within perhaps a quarter mile of the creek. "Cut the horses loose from the traces and let the wagon go. Get your wife up on one horse and yourself on the other. Now, there is no more time to argue about it." It was the kind of decisive, clear-eyed command that brooked no argument, and young Asher, to his credit, obeyed instantly, boosting his frightened wife up onto the bare back of one of the wagon horses while Alfred cut the last tangled trace free with his knife. They made it across the creek and up onto the far bank with perhaps 5 minutes to spare before the fire itself reached the water's edge. And there, from the relative safety of the far side, the assembled families watched the wall of flame check itself against the creek, exactly as Alfred had predicted, hissing and smoking along the water's edge, but unable to leap the open water in the face of even that fierce a wind. Maria sat her horse at the top of the bank, soot streaked across her face, her hair come entirely loose from its pins now and whipping wild around her shoulders, and watched the fire burn itself out along the far side of the creek with an exhaustion so complete it felt almost like peace. It was only then, in the strange lull after the immediate danger had passed, that she noticed Alfred was not beside her. "Alfred!" she called, twisting in her saddle, scanning the confused knot of families and animals gathered on the bank. "Alfred, where are you?" "Here," came his voice, rough and strained, from somewhere down near the water's edge, and she rode toward it to find him kneeling in the shallow creek water, one arm cradled awkwardly against his side, his shirt sleeve scorched black along the forearm where he had, she would learn moments later, gone back for the Whitfield boy Daniel, when the 13-year-old's horse had bolted at the last moment and nearly carried him back toward the flames. "You are burned," she said, dismounting so quickly she nearly stumbled, dropping to her knees beside him in the cold creek water without a second thought for her own skirts. "It is not so bad," Alfred said, though the tightness in his voice told a different story. "Daniel's horse bolted. I went after him. It is only my arm, Marya, and only where the sleeve caught." "Let me see it," she said, and there was no arguing with the tone of her voice now, the same tone she had used to command young Asher to abandon his wagon. She rolled back the ruined sleeve with careful hands, wincing at the angry red welt of the burn along his forearm, not deep enough to be truly dangerous but painful enough that she could see the strain of it in the set of his jaw. "Dr. Prout is just up the bank," she said. "Come, now." "I am not asking, Alfred, I am telling you, the same way you have told me things these past weeks, and you are going to let me help you the way I let you help me the night Hardy came to my homestead." Something in his exhausted face eased into something almost like a smile despite the pain. "I believe I have been thoroughly and fairly answered," he said. "Lead on, then." Dr. Prout, working by lantern light on the creek bank while 30 exhausted, soot-stained refugees settled themselves as best they could among the cottonwood trees to wait out what remained of the terrible night, cleaned and wrapped the burn with practiced hands, assuring Marya over her shoulder that it would heal cleanly if kept clean and given time. "You saved that boy's life," Marya said quietly, once the doctor had moved on to check on the Whitfield children and she and Alfred sat together a little apart from the others, his bandaged arm resting carefully across his knee. "You saved a good many more than that tonight," Alfred said. "The Ashers, their horses." Half the families along this creek would not have known which way to run if you had not known every trail and every crossing better than any map. "I have lived in this county 8 years, Marya, and you led that whole retreat as though you had planned it in advance." "I have ridden every foot of this creek since I was 15 years old," Marya said. "It is the one thing my father left me that no fire and no man like Garrett Kessler can ever take away, that knowledge, that belonging to this land in a way that goes bone deep. Tonight it was finally good for something more than proving up a claim." They sat together as the sky slowly lightened toward a smoke-hazed dawn, the wind finally beginning to ease. The fire behind them burned down at last to smoldering black ground that would smoke for days but threaten no more homes. Alfred reached over with his uninjured arm and took her hand, and this time neither of them spoke at all, content simply to sit together in the exhausted, grateful silence of two people who had together saved 30 lives and lost nothing that could not be rebuilt. "I love you," Alfred said finally, quietly into that silence, the words coming without the ceremony he had perhaps once imagined offering them with. "I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it because you rode into Larkspur once and saved my life, or because you rode beside me tonight and saved 30 more. I say it because I have watched you make hard decisions and stand by them, and comfort frightened children, and pull terrified horses out of a burning barn with your own 2 hands, and I have never in my life admired anyone the way I admire you, Marya Carter. Whatever comes next, with Kessler, with the land, with all of it, I would be honored to face it standing beside you rather than in front of you." Marya turned to look at him, her face streaked with soot and exhaustion, and now with tears that had nothing to do with fear. "I love you too, Alfred Ralston," she said. "I have loved you, I think, since the night you rode up out of that storm to stand beside me in my own yard instead of trying to send me away from it. I do not intend to let Garrett Kessler or anyone else take away what we have found here, not the land, and not each other." The rebuilding began within days, as it always did on the frontier, homestead families helping one another raise new barns and repair scorched fences. The telegraph company sending a crew out from Wichita Falls to restring the fallen line along the creek. It was during that same week that word arrived, carried by the young Fort Worth attorney who had been investigating the railway's tangled dealings, that a signed confession had finally been obtained from Prescott Dane, Kessler's lawyer, in exchange for leniency in his own prosecution. A confession that laid out in exhaustive, damning detail every forged deed, every bribe, and the full arrangement made with Boone Hardy for the murder of Everett Whitfield. Judge Beckwith set the full hearing for the second week of September, to be held in the largest space Larkspur possessed, the combined church and meeting hall at the center of town, and word of the hearing traveled fast along the wire and by word of mouth through every ranch and homestead in the county. For by now everyone understood that what was being decided was not merely one man's guilt, but the fate of Cottonwood Creek itself, and the water rights of every family who depended on it. 2 nights before the hearing, Boone Hardy was captured attempting to cross back into Texas near the Red River, having run out of money and, it seemed, out of patience with hiding, and Alfred rode the 2 days needed to bring him back to Larkspur in irons himself, unwilling to trust the task to anyone else after everything the man had already attempted. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and still, the violent winds of the preceding weeks having finally exhausted themselves, leaving behind a sky of such perfect blue calm that it seemed almost to mock the turmoil the county had endured. The meeting hall filled well beyond its ordinary capacity. Ranchers and homesteaders and merchants crowded onto benches and standing along the walls, for everyone in Larkspur understood that this was not simply a trial, but a reckoning for the entire community's near-fatal willingness to hang an innocent man on a stranger's word. Garrett Kessler sat at a table before the judge's bench, still in the same gray coat, though it had lost its careful pressing after weeks in a jail cell, his lawyer beside him looking considerably less confident than the situation seemed to demand. Boone Hardy sat separately, under armed guard, his face set in the sullen resignation of a man who understood the arithmetic of his situation had finally turned against him for good. Maria Carter testified first, standing before the crowded hall with a composure that seemed to draw strength from every difficult decision she had made in the weeks before, laying out in clear, methodical detail the exact wording of the telegram she had decoded, the precise sequence of dates and names, her voice never once wavering even as Kessler's lawyer attempted, with increasing desperation, to suggest she might have misread or misremembered a message received under the pressure of a windstorm months before. "I have operated this county's telegraph line for 6 years," Maria said, meeting the lawyer's eyes without flinching. "I have decoded messages through fair weather and foul, through storms considerably worse than the one that garbled Mr. Dane's telegram to Mr. Kessler. I did not misread it. I understood it perfectly, and I rode into town that same evening because I understood exactly what it meant for a man about to be hanged for a crime he did not commit." Ruth Whitfield testified next, her voice breaking only once as she described her husband's growing fear in the weeks before his death, his discovery of the altered deed, his refusal to sign away water rights he had held for a decade. Dr. Prout testified to the wound that had killed Everett Whitfield, a wound that matched, in every particular the young Fort Worth attorney had established through careful correspondence, the knife later found planted among Alfred Ralston's effects, a knife that Boone Hardy himself, faced finally with the full weight of Prescott Dane's signed confession, admitted under questioning to having carried and used on the night in question. It was Alfred's testimony, delivered last, and with the plain, unadorned honesty that had always been his particular strength, that seemed to settle the matter beyond any remaining doubt in the crowded hall. He spoke of his own arrest, of the strange speed with which the makeshift committee had moved to condemn him without a proper trial, of the moment the rope had tightened around his neck, and he had made peace, in that terrible instant, with the idea of dying for a crime committed by another man entirely, because a wealthy stranger's word had carried more weight in a frightened town than a lawman's years of honest service. "I do not stand here today," Alfred said, looking out over the crowded hall, "because I was clever enough to save myself. I stand here because a woman with more courage than any person I have known rode into a mob with nothing but the truth in her hand, and because this town, to its great credit, was willing to hear that truth even at the very last moment. I would ask that this hearing extend Miss Carter, and every family along Cottonwood Creek, the same willingness to hear the truth now, in the matter of their land and their water, that this town extended to me on the day of my own hanging. Garrett Kessler, given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, rose from his chair with the last remnants of his composure and attempted, for several long minutes, to characterize the entire affair as a series of unfortunate misunderstandings, a business arrangement gone regrettably wrong through the excessive zeal of subordinates acting without his full knowledge. It was Boone Hardy, sitting under guard at the side of the hall, who finally undid what remained of that defense. He knew, Hardy said suddenly, his voice carrying flat and bitter across the silent hall. Every word of it he knew. He told me himself what needed doing to Whitfield, and he told me himself to see about the woman at the telegraph office once the marshal was out of the way. I have spent 6 weeks running from a hanging. I do not even deserve half so much as that man deserves one, and I am done carrying his lies for him. The hall erupted into a low, furious murmur that Judge Beckwith had to call to order twice before it settled. Kessler, seeing the last of his careful fiction collapse in front of the entire town, made one desperate, final move, lunging suddenly toward the door of the meeting hall in a bid to escape before the judge could formally pronounce against him. He did not get 3 steps. Alfred Ralston, closer to the door than anyone else in the hall, caught him by the collar of his fine gray coat and had him face down against the floorboards with an efficiency that drew a startled gasp from half the assembled crowd. And within moments Kessler was in irons himself, his composure entirely gone, shouting threats and promises of lawyers and lawsuits that fell on a hall full of ears that had already heard quite enough. Garrett Kessler, Judge Beckwith said, once order had been restored and the prisoner stood, disheveled and defeated, before the bench, on the strength of the evidence presented today, including the sworn confession of your own attorney and the testimony of your own hired accomplice, this court finds sufficient cause to bind you over for trial on charges of conspiracy to murder, forgery of land deeds, and incitement to riot in the attempted lynching of Marshal Alfred Ralston. You will be transported to Fort Worth to stand trial before a proper jury, where I have no doubt the full weight of Texas law will be brought to bear upon you. As for the matter of Cottonwood Creek and the water rights so many families in this county depend upon, this court finds every deed altered or forged under your direction to be null and void, and restores full and lawful title to each rightful claimant, including the homestead of Everett Whitfield's widow and children, and the homestead of Miss Maria Carter, free and clear of any further claim by the Texas and Gulf Railway Company. The hall broke into something that was not quite cheering, for the seriousness of what had nearly happened still weighed heavily on every person present, but was nonetheless a sound of profound and communal relief, the sound of a community understanding that justice, however nearly it had almost failed them, had finally, properly arrived. It took the better part of an hour for the hall to empty, families lingering to embrace one another, to thank Maria and Alfred both with a warmth that left neither of them quite able to speak for long stretches, Ruth Whitfield weeping openly as she thanked Alfred for the life of her son, and Maria for the life of her whole family's future on the creek. Boone Hardy and Garrett Kessler were led out under guard toward the wagon that would begin their journey to Fort Worth, and the crowd watched them go with a silence far more damning than any shouted curse could have been. By the time the last well-wisher had finally departed, the September afternoon had softened into a long golden evening, the kind that comes to the Texas plains after a hard season finally breaks, and Maria and Alfred found themselves alone at last on the steps of the meeting hall, the town settling into its ordinary evening quiet around them. "It is over," Maria said softly, looking out at the empty street, the dust of the crowd's departure still hanging faintly in the last of the light. "The trial in Fort Worth is not," Alfred said, "though I do not believe there is any real doubt left about how it will end, not with Dane's confession and Hardy's testimony both against him. But yes, the part of it that threatened you and threatened this town, that part is over." Maria turned to look at him, taking in the bandaged arm still healing beneath his rolled sleeve, the tired lines around his eyes that spoke of weeks of worry finally allowed to ease, and felt something settle inside her that she had not fully allowed herself to feel until this exact moment, now that there was no more danger left to hold at bay. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said the night of the fire, about wanting to stand beside me rather than in front of me. I find I have been thinking of very little else these past 2 weeks, in truth, between decoding messages and testifying, and worrying whether Kessler's lawyer would somehow twist my words." "And what have you concluded?" Alfred asked. "After all that thinking?" "That I do not want to spend the rest of my life proving up my father's claim alone," Maria said, the words coming steadier than she had expected them to, though her heart was pounding as though she had ridden 6 miles at a full gallop all over again. "I want to spend it building something with you, Alfred Ralston, on land that is mine by law and by my own 2 hands, but that I would be glad, more than glad, to call ours if you are willing to have it be so." Alfred did not answer with words at first. He reached out with his uninjured hand and drew her gently toward him, and when their lips met it was unhurried and certain, the kind of kiss that carried in it every quiet evening on the porch step and every hard-won trust earned across weeks of danger, a promise made not in a single dramatic gesture but built patiently out of 100 smaller ones. "I would be honored," he said finally, his voice rough with feeling, "to call that land ours and to call you my wife, if you will have me, Maria. Not as a man who protects you, though I will always want to stand beside you when danger comes. As a partner. As someone who has watched you lead 30 frightened people across a burning creek in the dark and understood in that moment that I had never once in my life admired another human being so completely." "Yes," Maria said, laughing now through tears that had crept up on her without warning, the accumulated weight of weeks of fear and courage finally finding release in simple, uncomplicated joy. "Yes, Alfred, I will have you, and I will have this life, whatever it brings, so long as we face it together." Yes. They were married 3 weeks later, on a clear October afternoon, with the last of the summer's dust finally settled and the first cool edge of autumn in the wind, in a small ceremony at Maria's homestead, attended by nearly the whole of Larkspur and every family along Cottonwood Creek who owed their land and their lives, in some measure, to the courage of the bride and the steadfast devotion of the groom. Ruth Whitfield brought a wedding quilt stitched by half the women of the county. Dr. Prout stood as witness alongside a beaming, thoroughly reformed Corliss, who had spent the intervening weeks trying, in every way he knew how, to make amends for the committee's near-fatal haste. Judge Beckwith, delayed on his circuit specifically to preside over the ceremony himself, pronounced them husband and wife beneath the same cottonwood trees where 30 frightened refugees had once watched a wildfire burn itself out against the water. Alfred did not ask Maria to give up her position at the telegraph office, understanding by then, with the hard-won clarity of a man who had learned his lesson thoroughly, that her work was as much a part of who she was as her rifle or her claim, and Maria, for her part, welcomed him fully into partnership on the land her father had first broken with a borrowed plow and a stubborn heart. A partnership built not on one person's protection of the other, but on the equal weight each brought to every decision that followed. That evening, after the last guests had finally departed down the darkening trail toward town, Maria and Alfred stood together on the porch of the homestead that was now, by law and by love both, entirely their own, watching the first stars emerge over Cottonwood Creek in a sky finally, blessedly still. "No more storms tonight," Alfred said, an arm settled easily around her shoulders. "There will always be storms eventually," Maria said, leaning into him with the particular contentment of a woman who had fought for everything she now held and intended never to take a moment of it for granted. But I find I am no longer afraid of them, so long as I am facing them beside you. Then let them come, Alfred said, and pressed a kiss to her hair. For I intend to spend the rest of my life exactly here, beside you, on this land you fought so fiercely to keep, for as long as we both shall live. And there, beneath a sky swept clean of dust and danger both, with the creek running quiet and full behind them, and the whole of their shared future stretching out ahead like the wide, unbroken plains of Texas itself, Maria Carter and Alfred Ralston began the rest of their life together, equal partners in every sense that mattered, their love as steady and unshakable as the land itself.